herd of fluffy, wild Kashmiri goats made the news back in March at the onset of the lockdown when they descended on the Welsh town of Llandudno to explore where all the people had got to. Now, after an investigation by a scientist in London, it turns out that goats are not only curious creatures, but, as the first domestic livestock species some 11,000 years ago, they're also able to understand human gestures like pointing. Eva Higginbotham spoke to Alan McElligott from the University of Roehampton about his research.
In some respects, it's relatively simple in terms of investigating whether goats can follow human pointing gestures. And in the experiment, for example, we had one person in a small enclosure with goats. We had two red buckets in that enclosure. In the initial phase of testing, the person was seated on a chair. The two red buckets were about sort of a meter to her left and right, and she pointed at the bucket that contained a food reward. And so the goat had to choose the correct bucket for getting the food reward because there was no food reward in the other one. So in some respects, it's relatively simple. But on the other hand, people don't usually expect livestock animals to have these abilities. So in the experiment, we did find that a large proportion of the goats were able to follow the human pointing gesture.
Great. And how do you know that they weren't smelling the food? How good is a goat's sense of smell?
I guess they could potentially smell the food, although the food reward in question, we use a small piece of pasta usually, actually a small piece of dry penne pasta, which doesn't give off a lot of smell. And also from the videotapes of the goats, of course, when they were released to investigate which bucket was correct, they were several meters away. And I don't think they would be able to discern the difference of a small piece of pasta from a large bucket at that distance.
Who knew that goats were into pasta?
Where we work, Buttercup Sanctuary for Goats near London, actually, I don't know who realized it first, but they've known for quite a long time. But yes, goats really like pasta.
So the goats that you worked on come from a sanctuary, and did they have any names?
They all have names, actually. I mean, some of the names that we worked with, Annie, Dingle, Gilbert, Pookie, Ralph, Vern, Sticky, Archie, Cicero. So they all have names.
What about if you took your sort of everyday mountain goat and tried to do the experiment with them? What do you think would happen then?
Good question. I mean, the wild ancestor of goats still exists in the world. It's called a Bezoar goat and found in sort of Western Asia, Southeast Europe, sort of around Turkey and Georgia. It would be very interesting, but if you just took a wild animal, you couldn't test it, obviously, because they wouldn't want to be anywhere near people. What you would have to do is take kid goats and hand rear them and make sure that they're used to being around people, and then you could test them. And that would be a very interesting thing to do, but nobody has done it. I can say that people have done similar or related work in dogs, and there are a couple of research groups in the world that have actually hand reared wolf puppies. So they end up with adult wolves that are used to being around people. And so then they carry out the same tests in both wolves and dogs, and there are always slight differences. And often the interpretation is, if they find that dogs in particular are better at perceiving certain information rather than hand-reared wolf puppies, then they suggest it's an effective domestication. But overall, the question is really interesting, but we don't know until somebody has done that sort of research.
Alan McElligott and his paper on goats has just been published in Frontiers in Psychology.